Hello and welcome to the Climate Cooling Mini Summit, an event of the National Sustainability Festival. This event is proudly supported by the Breakthrough National Centre for Climate Restoration, the Climate Rescue Accord, and the Council and Community Action in the Climate Emergency. This afternoon's event comprises 3 sessions. The one now is on global cooling. At 2:15, we're having Australia's Climate Accord on political parties who are working on a climate rescue platform to stop and reverse global heating. And after a short break at 3:15, we'll have Reclaiming the Climate Emergency Locally. How can we accelerate levels by all actions of government to reverse warming? There'll be a short break between each session, and you'll be able to use the same link to come back into the event if you choose to leave the session at any time. We will take some audience questions following the formal presentation, so please place your questions in the chat and ensure that they are succinct. Our opening session is on climate, cooling and activism, a very different climate conversation, with 2 members of the Finnish youth organisation Operaatio Arktis and their campaign for climate repair to protect the Arctic. And we particularly thank them for joining us at 4 o'clock in the morning, 4 a.m. their time. So this session is brought to you by the Breakthrough National Centre for Climate Restoration. I'm David Spratt, Research Director for Breakthrough, and I'll be your host for the first session until 2 o'clock. This event is coming to you from Melbourne, Australia, the land of the Wurundjeri people, part of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and recognise that this land was never ceded. As the world experiences an unprecedented burst in warming with extraordinary events that have shocked scientists, it's become clear that mitigation alone, that is, reducing fossil fuels to zero, is not in itself sufficient to deliver a safe climate and protect the world's peoples and ecosystems. Nowhere is that clearer than at the poles, where global heating is at its fastest. So before we talk to Annie and Anton from Operation Arctic in English about their vision and their work, let's have a quick look at what's happening over the last year and the lessons it contains. So I'll just share my screen. Climate disruption and climate repair. So last year, scientists were astounded by what happened in the climate system. Words like astounding, staggering, unnerving, bewildering. Others said we are hitting record-breaking extremes much sooner than I expected. That's frightening, scary and concerning. That was Sarah Perkins Kirkpatrick from the University of New South Wales. And it's so far out of anything we've seen, it's almost mind-blowing. So last year, as you can see in the diagram at right, the black line, warming was mind-blowing. It was the first year where warming reached 1.5 degrees over the pre-industrial level. In fact, the last 80 days, the last half a year, has been 1.7 degrees of average warming. And perhaps the most spectacular figure was in September last year, when it broke the previous record by a full half a degree. And in all the records that were broken, 2 of the most astounding were sea surface temperatures and Arctic sea ice loss, which were way beyond what scientists had projected. So James Hansen, the former great head of climate science for NASA, says we are very close to a warming degree trend. If you look at the diagram on right, that yellow band that he projected perhaps a year ago is actually where we're heading. He says the warming is accelerating, that effectively we've reached 1.5, we'll probably be at 1.7 by the end of this decade, 2030, and by 2 degrees by the late 2030s, which is, way ahead of what people thought even 5 or 10 years ago. So now there's widespread recognition that the rate of warming is accelerating. So the new head of the World Meteorological Organization said the rate of human-caused climate change is accelerating, but, and I quote, we are not there in terms of our scientific understanding of the implications of this acceleration. That is, scientists cannot yet fully explain what happened last year and where we are. But what we do know, if we look at the lower diagram, which is Earth's energy imbalance, which is a measure of the amount of incoming radiation versus outgoing radiation. And we can see as we go towards the right that that is lifting up higher and higher. So the Earth's imbalance is getting larger in quantity, and that's a good indicator of future warming. So where are we going? A few years ago, some of the world's leading scientists produced a thumbnail called The Carbon Law, in which they said, if you want to hold warming to 2 degrees, and obviously 2 degrees is not altogether safe, you would have to drop emissions by half every decade, from 2020 to 2030 by half, and again from 2030 to 2040, and so on. Holding warming to 2 degrees necessitated halving emissions each decade, they said. But in reality, if we look at what's happening around the world, and these are figures from the Production Gap Report from the United Nations last year, we can see that coal is projected to go down, but the other two, oil and gas, are projected to go up. So this is an analysis based on what countries say they are going to do in terms of their investment in new fossil fuels. So greenhouse gases and coal hit record in 2023, and gas and oil producers plan to keep on expanding production. And that includes the world's largest 5 fossil fuel emissions. That is the United States, China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and unfortunately, Australia. So when you put that together and you look at where global emissions will be in 2050, looking at the red line here on current government policies, we can see that in 2050, emissions will be 5–10% at most lower than they are. That may change if governments do more, but at the moment, we are heading towards emissions being as high in 2050 as they are today. And of course, that means that we are going to fly past 2 degrees. When we think about these risks, the most important thing is to understand that we have to look at the worst case possibilities. What is the plausible worst things that can happen? Because that is where the damage is greatest at the high end. And that's what governments have failed to do. They are looking at the averages rather than the high-end possibilities. So where are we heading? Look, scientists I talk to all have a 3. They say we're heading towards 3 degrees or more, given the lack of action, those continuing high emissions. And it may be a good deal more because of the reinforcing feedbacks in the system. So the preeminent UK think Chatham House a couple of years ago said a plausible worst case scenario is perhaps 3.5 degrees or more, but this could be an underestimate if tipping points are reached sooner than the orthodox science suggests, which is now actually what's happening. So unfortunately, that's where we're heading. And a survey 3 years ago of IPC scientists asked where we were going, and you can see that long orange-red line. The majority, almost half, said 3 degrees, and more than 60%, almost 65%, 3 degrees or more, and 82% said they thought warming would be catastrophic in our lifetime. So that, unfortunately, is the picture of where we are. Is this a civilizational threat? I think the world's leading and most eminent scientists are now all saying yes. Professor Tim Lenton, who's done a lot of that work on tipping points and climate boundaries last year, said, if we carry on the way we are now, I can't see this civilization lasting to the end of this century. And I think that's a fairly frank view that is widespread amongst scientists, even if a lot of them are not so keen to say it publicly. And one great example of that is all the work that's been done on extreme heat. So here's an image, and you can see in the shaded areas, regions which by 2.7 degrees, so we're looking at about 2055, 2060, perhaps 40 years from now, regions that will have heat that humans have never previously experienced, which is more or less saying regions where people would not be able to survive in the heat of summer without air conditioning and artificial means. And you can see it covers the top quarter of Australia, a good bit of Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia and Thailand, across to India and Pakistan, of course, right through the Middle East, sub-Saharan Africa, and perhaps saddest of all, a large part of the Amazon. So this is the desertification and the drying that will come on the present trajectory. 1/3 of the planet around the equatorial regions will be uninhabitable, says Johan Rockström, one of the leading experts on tipping points. To emphasise that, Chatham House 3 years ago, I did a report, and they said that by 2040, 2050, unless emissions rapidly decline, and they are not at the moment, we'd expect food demand to increase 50% over the next 30 years, but there will be a 30% drop in crop yields. Now, that equation simply doesn't have an answer except the one that Dave gave, which these cascading impacts will drive to, and I think this is understated, political instability, greater national insecurity, and regional and international conflict. That is breakdown. So many scientists are now saying, because this is the normative question that large parts of the climate movement never ask, is where do we need to go to preserve our planet, to preserve our vital ecosystems? And Andrew King from the University of Melbourne says, from a long-term perspective, a justifiable aim is a future climate akin to pre-industrial conditions. John Schellenhuber, the former director of Potsdam Institute, says our survival would depend very much on how well we're able to draw down back to pre-industrial levels. That is, leading scientists are saying it is important to cool the climate back to where we came from in the mid-19th century. So to get to the nub of today's question, which is cooling, what do we need to do? On the current path, emissions are going to go up and up and up, as is illustrated. There's obviously a danger level up on the y-axis of increasing impacts and temperature, and there's a level for cascading impacts. And I think that dotted line is perhaps where we are now, because we can already see that we are past certain tipping points and that things are really escalating. Even talking about slowdown of the Atlantic circulation. Obviously, going to emissions fast can bend that impacts and curve down a lot, but not below the dotted line by itself. Obviously, with large drawdown taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, we can get back to a safe level, but that is going to take time, perhaps the rest of this century, because drawdown is a relatively slow process. And so the conclusion we come to is that some form of active cooling, trying now to cool vital ecosystems and or the planet to stop those tipping points, and that moving into a hothouse or unstoppable warming is now an option we need to think about. The drawdown options are many, where they're nature-based solutions like reforestation, ecosystems, sequestration, and so on. Technical solutions like negative emissions construction using wood rather than concrete. And then, of course, there are a number of cooling options, which we'll be talking to with Anton and Annie, including mirrors, cloud brightening, solar reflection, and so on. So the crucial messages in all of this is that we need zero emissions really fast. The Earth is already too hot, so we need drawdown. Damage is and will become dangerous before long-term solutions and mitigation are effective. So we need safe means of immediate cooling to protect people and nature. And I'll just finish with some of the work that Anton and Annie and their group have been doing. Some really important statements. Climate repair means deliberate measures taken to prevent negative consequences of global warming. And I think this is really important, that can no longer be prevented with certainty through emissions reductions alone. The second point, even staying at 1.5 degrees does not guarantee a stable climate. Thirdly, in terms of the Arctic, which is where their priority is, the most promising technologies are marine cloud brightening and aerosol injection, which we'll talk about. Fourthly, there are knowledge gaps, but there are risks there are risks in acting, but also risks in not acting and not knowing, and that climate repair research has to be conducted today and not tomorrow. So that's the end of the presentation, and it's my great pleasure to welcome our guests, Annie Pokala and Anton Keshinen, who are two of the founders of the Finnish advocacy organisation Operatio Arctis. Annie is the project manager and Anton is the head of strategy. They're doing some really interesting things that are different from most climate activists and advocacy groups. So let's start with the beginning of AO. Annie, apologies again for the early hour, but I understand that some of you were involved in XR Finland, and that you were students at the University of Helsinki. So what was it that led you into this idea that sparked the formation of AO?
Yeah, thank you, David, and thanks for having us here. Yeah, we're essentially like a group of friends who originally got together, got to know each other by organizing civil disobedience campaigns in Extinction Rebellion Finland. So we were trying to get the Finnish government um, to state or make like a statement of a climate emergency in Finland and get the government to reduce emissions a lot quicker than they're doing right now. And after what was like our biggest mobilization success in Nexar a couple of years back, we decided to kind of take a step back and look at the science and look at especially what was happening in the Arctic area. And well, it was a lot worse than we thought. Turns out that there's kind of like the Arctic climate system that's already starting to collapse in ways that we can't stop anymore by just reducing emissions, or at least that's very likely. So yeah, I mean, as young people, as people who are like, as you said in the presentation, like one of the quotes was that like this person can't see civilization maybe lasting to the end of the century. Like I'm supposed to be living in 2080s on paper. So I mean, we were horrified and we were like, okay, if there's any possible way of preventing this like Arctic climate catastrophe from happening, we should look into it. And so yeah, we started looking into additional measures, talking to scientists and politicians and researchers about these techniques, and very soon realized that there is a really growing need for more research and for developing not only like these technologies but the policy and governments around them as well.
So if we don't cool the Arctic in the right time frame, what happens to the Arctic?
Well, there's a lot of like these, well, we talk about like the kind of vicious cycle of heating. So there's a lot of like, because the Arctic Ocean is covered with the sea ice, which is kind of sun blocking shield. Once that's gone, there's more dark surface, so more heat gets sucked into the area. Permafrost is going to melt, like permanently frozen land that's been there for like crazy long times. It's gonna like thaw, which is gonna mean infrastructure just being destroyed. People's houses are gonna be washed into the sea. There's a huge threat to food safety, and what comes to that, there's like especially indigenous peoples are on the front lines of these impacts. Like the North Water Pilinia is greatly under threat. So there's a lot of like these very existential threats that we're facing if we don't get the Arctic to cool down. And also like the Arctic climate system is like the thermostat for like the whole Earth's climate. So there's a lot of like extreme weather that we're probably going to face once the jet stream is going to slow down because of the heating. Yeah, a great
People
many.
used to talk about the canary in the coal mine, that what starts in the Arctic doesn't stop in the Arctic.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. It has very, very global effects. Yeah.
Thanks, Annie. So Anton, one of your statements, which I read out briefly, climate repair means deliberate measures taken to prevent negative consequences of global warming that can no longer be prevented with certainty through emissions reductions alone. So what are the actual, in technical or direct terms, what are the actual ways of cooling the Arctic and repairing the Arctic?
Yeah, thanks, David, and thanks for having us. Well, I should say maybe the most kind of promising, or yeah, the most promising option would be to maybe spread some cooling aerosols in the stratosphere, like sulfate aerosols probably, which would then reduce the amount of incoming sunlight in that area, and of course then lower the surface temperatures. That's kind of the obvious one, and it's the most researched, I should say, and it's been demonstrated in many simulations to at least reduce the surface melt of Greenland ice sheet, but also it's shown to be able to preserve Arctic sea ice even under such scenarios where it would be lost otherwise, but also, yeah, for sure, to cool down the areas where there's a lot of permafrost. But then the other technique that's kind of suggested, a bit less studied for cooling the Arctic, would be marine cloud brightening. So basically, you could try to make the marine clouds more reflective in the areas where there's a lot of heat transport towards the Arctic. So that would be like Northern Atlantic, maybe perhaps even in the area where Arctic Ocean connects to Pacific Ocean. And yeah, so you could try to cool down the ocean and air currents that are taking heat.
So this is essentially, without putting it too crudely, spraying water vapor at a certain size, which is really important in the atmosphere to boost the cloud cover and reduce the amount of incoming heat.
Yeah, that's right, and that's something that people in the Australia have already tried to do, or at least done some field studies in the hopes of preserving at least parts of the Great Barrier Reef that we know is kind of gone already if there's no new measures, that we would find.
So this is still at a research stage, but it is now not just research in the laboratory, but research in practice out in the real world.
That's right, and like practically, yeah, we know that aerosols affect clouds, of course, because clouds are like all of the clouds, every single droplet that you see is water vapor that's condensated around some small aerosol particle. And yeah, basically you could just, as you said, spread sea salt to create more smaller droplets in one cloud to make them brighter. And as you said, yeah, it's becoming like, yeah, some groups are starting to try to do it in practice already.
So the idea, if this would work, is it would take enough heat out of the Arctic to stop the loss of the rest of the sea ice in summer, and also to stop or slow the disintegration of Greenland, which in itself could be a driver for the slowing or stopping of the Atlantic circulation, which is like the really big issue.
Yeah, that's the big issue now, and for good reasons, because that's like the end of the civilization if we get to the tipping point of the AMOC.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Annie, we might come back to the technologies, but in terms of your advocacy and the politics, I know you've done a lot of work within Finland, talking to people in the political system. Have you had some success?
Yeah, I mean, good question, how to define success. I mean, in the sense, one thing that I would say is that when we started doing this work about 2 years ago, there was like no one that knew what climate repair meant. And that was like one of our like biggest things that we wanted to like do, is make people aware of the fact that it exists and it's something that should be part of the climate discussion. So maybe our biggest thing that we did here like nationally is that we had like this first kind of international climate repair or climate intervention conference. It was like a big event in the city center, and it did get some attention, and it was a very big success all in all. But like these events and lobbying and things that we've done is kind of gone to a point where, like, compared to 2 years ago, like there are actually politicians with, you know, in like pretty major power positions that now know the term, that now know even like they have some tools to kind of take part in that discussion, which is really important. And there has been like we have had like a member of parliament that has now kind of taken the term and taking kind of a lot of interest in our work, who has done like a written question to our government that's right in power right now. about Finland maybe perhaps like preparing itself to possibly maybe having to do some sort of climate repair, climate intervention at some point. So we have seen this term kind of slowly getting into the political discussions, and there are a lot of like because we've done a lot of work, especially in like climate activist groups as well. So I think we have succeeded, at least in some way, in bringing that kind of that vocabulary kind of forward. Yeah.
Yeah, and I saw a video of you interviewed at COP28. You all went to Abu Dhabi, the center of the fossil fuel world. I think several of you went. What was your experience there? I know you were working with some activists, including from Africa, who also want to talk about the need for climate repair research.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was like one of the biggest takeaways for me, at least at COP, was meeting all these young people from across the world who are like ready to discuss this and who are very much like very passionate about having these discussions and having research being done not only in the Arctic area but in like their local communities as well, and a lot of interesting conversations with them and about like maybe like building this kind of network of young people from all over the world who are who really want to push this research forward, and also having discussions with people who are very skeptical towards climate interventions and who might be even against even researching any of these techniques. And yeah, it can be very difficult. Like we did have some difficult conversations with people, but I at least got, you know, a lot of things out of those conversations as well. Because it's really important to like not silence those people, but to bring them into the conversation as well and really hear them out, because usually they have a lot of good points about the risks as well. Yeah.
Yes. Well, the question of risks was on my list of things to talk about, Anton. I mean, many of you put out a very good report called Arctic Endgame, which is on your website, which I would really encourage people to read. And in there, you had a section about risks, and you said risks are different for different groups, and risks are different for young people than they are for baby boomers like me. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes. So what we try to do there is to bring this new element into the idea of how to conduct risk analysis. As you have also talked about, risk analysis is that risks are the likelihood of outcome multiplied with the severity of the outcome. And I think that's true, that's correct. But what we tried to do there is to create this kind of new discussion about, well, this is kind of obvious, but risks are different for different people. For example, for my future kids, the risk of, you know, losing the AMOC in 2080 is like an actual risk for their livelihoods and life and future. As for people now making decisions about climate, like emissions or climate interventions or anything related to that, it's just theoretical thing. So I think that's kind of self-explanatory. Yeah.
So the risk or damage to you is materially much greater than the risk or damage for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you also said because some of the greatest climate impacts, because climate impacts are also a function of the economic capacity to respond or to adapt. So in the developing world where there is not the same economic capacity to adapt or to respond, the impact can be greater. So there's also an equity issue in risks.
Oh yes, absolutely. It's a huge one, and not just that, not just the economic opportunities or possibility to adapt, but also geography. It's a huge thing, because you know, if we think about tropics, it's mostly low-income countries in the tropics, and a lot of people live in the tropical areas or subtropical areas. That's most of the people in the world. and these areas are the ones that will see the extreme heat waves. But also when we think about sea level rise, it's going to be bigger in the tropics compared to, for example, in Finland or the southern parts of Australia, for example, because when the ice sheets are melting and losing ice by runoff and calving and stuff like that, their capability to pull stuff towards them, like the gravity of the ice sheets are getting smaller, which means that the water is going to rise more further away from them. So just one example of how it's a lot more terrible situation for people in the global south.
So Annie, in a sense, I mean, there's often a discussion, particularly from opponents of climate interventions, that you shouldn't do these things until you're absolutely certain. But I mean, there's also a risk in not acting, because warming is getting worse, and if you wait too long, the problem becomes more and more unsolvable. So you've talked about in your report about what I would call the price or risk of delay of needing to act sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is one of the risks that we do want to remind people of, is that there are already people and places that are like researching these interventions and looking into even deploying them. So and there are a lot of like expert researchers that say that some sort of climate intervention is probably going to be done at some point somewhere. So I think that's a risk as well, of like not being prepared and to get into a situation with the heating where people start to panic and start, using these techniques or deploying them when they're not ready, when there's no proper governance, when it's the research or like the deployment is not done ethically. There can be like multiple there can be like international conflict that can arise from that sort of situation. So it's a question of preparing for that situations so that we can kind of have a informed opinion on maybe deploying them. And I there's a lot of like, I think our governments and like climate strategies worldwide, like they really lack that basic risk analysis of like as you said, David, in your presentation, like the one problem is that the worst scenario is not being taken into account in the risks analysis. And yeah, I think some people are ready to kind of just dismiss climate interventions outright without really actually weighing the risks of using them to not using them. But also we do lack the research kind of to really conduct a comprehensive risk analysis of especially like specific
it's a
techniques.
dilemma. It's a dilemma. So Anton, in terms of where the technology is and the research is, I mean, how close are we, and how close are scientists to saying we could actually deploy these things? I know with Marine Cloud Brightening, they're saying they're doing work, and I think it could be deployed in 4 or 5 years. So, I mean, we've got to balance the social and economic costs and the economic and social benefits. I mean, how far, if there were international agreements, how far away would you guess we could be from actually seeing this happen?
I have to give a bit complicated answer. So there's 2 factors here. I think one is the practical availability. So this means if we have the infrastructure, if we have the money, if we have the technology to do these interventions. And the other one is, when will the decision makers, would it be like governments or parliaments or whatever, when will these decision maker bodies believe that they have enough information to make the decision? And to the first question, well, some people have argued, for example, David Keith and the other guy, I don't remember the name, but they just put out an article 1 month ago, I think, where they said that even in 5 years we could start, or someone could start, a small scale deployment of SAI. which is stratospheric aerosol injection, by using these private jets to do that, because they can fly to 15 kilometers, and that would be enough in some areas of the world to reach this stratosphere. And sulfur, yeah, we know how to do that. So in 5 years, in theory, someone could start to do that. When it comes to marine cloud brightening, well, there is more uncertainty with the technology. So I don't think there is yet like enough capability to produce the optimal size of droplets. So to the other situation, or the other point, about when will decision makers believe they have enough information, that's something that will change over time. So we should avoid this idea of, or the thinking of this kind of shopping list thinking, as Andy Parker from Decrease Initiative has put it, which means that typically we like to think that there's like 10 things or X amount of things that we need to know before we can decide whether to do climate intervention or not. But when we move forwards, and when climate impacts get worse, people's tolerance for uncertainty, but also for negative side effects, which could have been in the first place reduced by more research, that tolerance will get bigger. So people will like, be more open to do more risky stuff with less information.
I think we could talk about climate repair governance for another whole hour, but just before we go to questions and discussion from our audience, I know I mentioned him in the presentation, James Hansen, perhaps sometimes called the godfather of modern climate science, and a man who really got me on this track. You've had some discussions with him, and he wants to do some sort of publication or paper with you, which is very exciting.
It is very exciting indeed. Yeah. We feel very honored about that. And we just get on call with him, and he suggested that, and for sure we're going to do it. So I think we are going to focus on the policy and climate intervention side, and he's going to do kind of like an update from the work he published last year, talking about the current situation with the Earth energy imbalance.
That's fabulous. That's a very big megaphone that he's got. On to some questions. The technically one to start with. Will recordings of this be available to watch afterwards? I'm asking Luke, and the answer is yes. The next question is from Stevie T, and I think you did talk about this in Arctic Endgame. How do you stop climate intervention being co-opted by people who want to continue business as usual?
Well, I can try to answer that. Oh, okay.
Yeah, you go ahead. You go ahead.
Okay, sure, then you can add. Well, so we can go deeper into the whole moral hazard argument or theory if we want, but short answer to that is by getting as much people on board, as much people to discuss this and create the public pressure. I think that's like in practical terms what we can do to get all of the civil society and academics and good people in politics to talk about it. So that's one way to try to prevent it.
You talked about sort of tying climate action to certain mitigation responsibilities. So you couldn't do one without doing the other. You sort of join them together. So you couldn't just continue emitting and doing this at the same time. We've got one question which I think is important. There's been a lot of talk recently because of research, and this is from Jane, about the slowdown of what's called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, sometimes slightly incorrectly called the Gulf Stream, which is that part of a global deep ocean circulation that for Europe carries water from the Caribbean up into Northern Europe and makes agriculture possible. And there's research saying there is a point at which it could slow down. And I've seen Stefan Rahmsdorf from Potsdam Institute, who's perhaps the world's leading figure in this saying that he thinks the chance of it slowing to stopping this century is greater than 10%. And he said that's an enormous risk. So, I mean, in terms of Finland, you're right up in the northeast end of Europe. What does the stopping of AMOC mean for living in Northern Europe for you?
Well, it's the end of our society in the way that we've used to think about it. Sorry for laughing, but yeah, seriously, well, people are projecting temperature drops, but something like 15, even 20 degrees, even 30 degrees in some parts of Norway. So that's, yeah, I don't see agriculture happening in that situation. So
Yes, I
yeah,
read
not just losing
somewhere.
like warm summers, but losing everything.
I read somewhere that somebody said it meant the functional end of agriculture in Northern Europe, which is just such a frightening thing. And the great driver of that, to come back to the work you're doing, the great driver of the AMOC slowing down is increased melting of Greenland, where all this freshwater dumping off Greenland is slowing down the circulation. And that's why your Arctic repair program is actually the core to stopping the AMOC slowdown.
That's right, and that's why we've been also thinking about like trying to maybe make this as a issue of national security even in Finland. But just real quick add, when you, David, said that you couldn't do climate interventions without also cutting emissions, I believe that's like ethically speaking right, but the problem is that you actually could do that. So just to say that that's a real risk, and we regard it as a serious risk, and
Yeah.
that's why we are in this field.
I mean, I agree absolutely. I mean, we've seen the Chinese government do climate engineering of a certain form already, with a program employing tens of thousands of people, where essentially they're trying to move moisture off the Tibetan plateau north onto the plains, which are drying out by various measures. And we also have that book by Kim Stanley Robinson, for those who like their climate fiction of a certain kind, where he has a scenario where it simply gets so hot in India and people die in such numbers that the Indian government, even without governance, decides to act. So, I mean, I think that is the fear. We've also had a question about something we haven't talked about yet, and I know you have done a little bit of work with a researcher called John Moore about physically trying to stop glaciers melting, what I think he called with seabed curtains, some physical way. Can either of you explain that briefly to our audience?
Yeah, I'll explain it the way that I understood it. I study gender studies, so I'm definitely not, know nothing about climate science. But so, yeah, the point is that we would build like these huge structures to support glaciers from underneath. So the problem with usually like the warm water currents hitting the glaciers from underneath is that they kind of destroy the glacier from underneath, so that they melt from underneath and then the tops kind of crumble down.
And they slide off the rock.
Yeah, exactly. So these seabed curtains would not kind of support the glaciers themselves, but they would keep the warm water currents from kind of getting to the underbellies of these glaciers, and they would kind of direct that warm water away from the glaciers. So that would like slow down the melting of these glaciers, so it wouldn't be so catastrophic. Yeah.
We've got a couple more questions on the politics of it. And I think it was you, Annie, or one of you in the COP28 videos, you talked about the existing climate movement and the paradigm of many of the existing groups, which I found really interesting. Could you talk about that briefly? Because it was sort of pretty incisive what you said.
Yeah, I mean, how we kind of look at it is that we have this old climate paradigm that was born like over 30 years ago, when we were in a completely different situation with climate change. And the old paradigm is about zeroing emissions and kind of hoping for the best. Okay, so it's like it doesn't really take it doesn't really like the old paradigm doesn't state which like ecosystems we should save and like which ecosystems are essential and to whom, and you know, it's not about like actively intervening, actively repairing. It's just about cutting emissions and hoping for the best. And that was like a very, you know, valid paradigm. That was like a very valid way of approaching climate change about 30 years ago. But now we're in a situation where some of these collapses are already happening in like certain ecosystems and certain climate system elements. So how we see it is that there's a real need for a paradigm shift into this new climate paradigm that is about active repairing, active intervening, that is about climate repair, about reducing emissions, but also providing active support for the parts of the climate system that are already breaking down. So it's also like, I think what's at the heart of it is kind of like even like this really moral and emotional issue, which is that we shouldn't just like step back and kind of accept all the damage that can be no longer avoided by just cutting emissions. So the new paradigm is about not accepting that damage and about not being indifferent about the things that we can no longer affect by just emission cuts. Yeah,
it's sort of having normative goals, which seem to be lacking in terms of. I mean, I said it's almost in the traditional climate movement. There's triage. There's things you'll save and things you won't save. And you just write off a whole lot of things because it's too difficult, rather than trying to establish a goal that could actually protect what's important. Another question, which you've responded to a little bit, I think, and that we've had two questions from Adam and somebody else about the response to what you've been saying. I think you mentioned, I mean, 10 years ago, you couldn't have, even 5 years, 3 years ago, it would be very difficult to have this conversation about climate repair and climate engineering. But it feels to me, as the physical circumstances change so quickly, that people are more open for this debate than they were. It feels like it's quite rapidly changing political territory in a way.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's unfortunately gonna, you know, increase, like that whole trend is gonna keep going. Yeah, I mean, I couldn't have imagined talking about interventions like 3 years ago. And that was because I didn't know about like climate science and I didn't know what the situation was. But even just like the fact that these conversations weren't really happening anywhere and no one was talking about them, like, to me, climate activism was always about zeroing emissions and hoping for the best. Like, it was always like this very straightforward thing. So kind of we are in very much like outside of our comfort zone, like having these discussions.
I think we all are.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Another question from Bryony. Have you created any links with other groups who are also interested in this 3Rs approach, just not mitigation, but drawdown and cooling? Are you finding, I know you've done some work and you said there's a couple of people in the European Parliament. Can you talk about the engagement or pickup of these ideas outside of your home country?
Yeah, sure. So there are some groups. Of course, there are researchers in various universities and research institutions. Also, some these smaller centers that are in the academia who are specifically looking into this problem. When it comes to political sphere, I don't know of any political parties or coalitions who would be actively talking about this yet. There will be at some point if it's up to us. When it comes to like NGOs or civil society, it's very small, but it's growing. So one of our friends, for example, set up this solar radiation SRM Youth Watch, Solar Radiation Management Youth Watch, who are working on to create more debate and discussion around this. There are NGOs in United States, especially like Silver Lining, who are putting money in the research. Yeah, I'm not just gonna, there's no point for me using time in like, telling about all of these organizations, but there are some. But the bottom line is that most are kind of indifferent or sidelined. They are most of the NGOs or climate movements are waiting for something to happen, some other people to take the lead. And then there are these this kind of small faction of people who are very opposed, very anti-research, who think that we are paid by fossil fuel industry and stuff like that.
I know that's not the case. You mentioned this briefly earlier. We've had a question from Sally. Has there been any engagement with the Sami group in Finland around this topic? I think you did mention this earlier with the Sami.
Yeah, we have, like, that was like from the get-go, we knew that was going to be a big thing, because like or like a very important thing to do, because there was like one SRM research that, like, that's the first things that I remember reading about like SRM research, was like this Harvard ScopeX thing that they tried to do in Samiland on like Sweden's side, and they had like no permits, neither from like the Swedish government or like local. So that, you know, you can imagine how that turned out. There was no research, you know, a good thing that there wasn't. So that's what we've been doing. We've been in touch with Sami Youth Council, Sami Climate Council, and that's something that we're really that we really want to do. And in our like big conference, Arctic Momentum, that I mentioned earlier, we had a lot of like workshops and discussions that and yeah, talk around that whole issue, because like Finland does have, and all of like these Arctic countries do have a long history of colonialism in the Sami land. So that is something that's really, really, really important to take into account in the research, and to take to be able for them to be participated in like from the get-go, not just answering questions that the research had already kind of formed, but to be part of the question forming, and like the whole process of like what we have been going to research. Yeah.
And we also found great ally from from the current president of Sami Parliament, Pirita Näkkäjärvi, with whom we are now planning to conduct this bigger workshop for the Finnish Sami Parliament.
And a couple of questions. The Finnish, to conclude, one I should have probably asked at the beginning, I didn't, and this is from Alex. Could you describe the impacts of climate change that you can see in Finland?
Yes, well, they are not too dramatic, to be honest, when in comparison to other areas of the world, of course. Well, the warming is a lot more here than in many other places when talking about degrees. So Finnish winters have warmed 5 degrees in the last, I don't know, 100 years. So that's a lot more than 1.5, which we are with the global average at the moment. Maybe the biggest things are like longer droughts and longer rainy seasons, probably because of the jet stream disruptions. So every second year, every third year, there are some like bigger crop damages happening. But yeah, to be honest, they are not too bad at the moment in Finland in comparison. Yeah.
And finally, tell me about your plans for the next year. I know you're going to do some work in the UK and talk to people there. What's the plan?
That's right. Well, next month we are heading for UK, but also into Brussels to talk to European Parliament people and the MEPs there. We are going to visit some universities, Cambridge, UCL, KCL in UK. Then we're going to write the paper with Jim Hansen, hopefully in the late spring, I think. But the bigger picture is for this year is to prepare experts to get into discussion. So the strategy goes a bit like this: to get like political action with climate intervention, we need public discussion, because politicians respond to public debates. But before that, it's quite helpful to get like climate experts in academia, but also in government, like climate panels, expert groups, to get them updated in the discussion, because when the public debate really gets bigger, it's quite good to have the people who government or who politicians will then consult to be able to be helpful in this situation. So that's the big picture.
Fantastic. Well, all power to your arm. And just before we go, in relation to the earlier question, the video of this session will be available. It will be available at breakthroughonline.org.au. And we already have a discussion paper on climate repair available on the Breakthrough site, breakthroughonline.org.au. And finally, on behalf of our audience, Annie and Anton, thank you for getting up so early. Thank you for really engaging discussion. I hope we answered a lot of the questions that were done, and we thank you for sharing your important work.
Thanks, David. I
Thank you so
hope we
much.
were of any entertainment. At least I
Well,
found myself
I'm not sure
bit
whether
clumsy.
civilization
4
is
a.m.
entertainment, but yes, you were. Can we say engaging?
Yeah. But we
Amazing.
should do this again, because there's tons of topics that
Sure.
we didn't have time to cover.
Thank you both so much. And just a reminder,
Thanks.
we'll now take a short break and be back at 2:15 for the next session hosted by the Climate Rescue Accord and Bryony Edwards. So we'll see you back online shortly.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello? I just want to share straight up. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Climate Rescue Accord presentation and panel discussion within the Climate Cooling Mini Summit with the Sustainable Living Festival. We are the Climate Rescue Accord, and this is our website, www.climaterescue.net. So first up, we'll have a quick presentation with myself, Bryony Edwards, and with Rob Bakes, and then we'll go on to a Q&A with the Climate Rescue Accord Working Group, which includes Mick 8, also known for the Sustainable Hour, Rob Bakes from Vote Climate 1, Antoinette Pitt from the Australian Progressive Party, Dr. Adam Cardellini from Animal Justice Party, and myself, Bryony Edwards from Fusion Party. So before we start, I'll acknowledge that we're meeting on the unceded lands of the traditional owners and pay my respects to elders past and present, recognising a continuing connection to land, sea and culture. And I'm calling in from Wurundjeri land. So the Climate Rescue Accord began as a climate policy discussion between individuals from federally registered Australian parties in June 2023. We started as 4 parties. It included the Reason Party, which unfortunately disbanded in January this year. So a working group resulted. The working group committed to a vision of pursuing what was required to stop and reverse global heating, with the ultimate vision of restoring a safe climate. Naturally, that's a global vision. And we are an Australian group, but we still think it's really important to have that global vision, because a successful outcome requires both that big vision, in this case to stop and reverse heating, restore a safe climate, as well as commensurate action to achieve that vision. And you can't do it without both those two things when the ambition is so great. And the commensurate action in this case, we see as the 3 Rs: reduce, remove and repair. And I'm thinking a lot of people in this presentation, I can't see how many there are, were hopefully at the last session, the global cooling session, with Operati Arctis from Finland and David Spratt. So you would have picked up a lot about what we're going to talk about with the Climate Rescue Accord if you were in that session. So I want to point out that no elected federal politician, or probably more importantly, environmental NGO, advocates for a vision or a commensurate strategy to stop, let alone reverse heating. We hear them talk about climate action, climate mitigation, but we never hear that big picture. What are we actually trying to achieve? And that's really important that we state this. So onto the commensurate actions. You know, we borrowed this lovely chart from Breakthrough, the reduce, remove, repair chart. On the left, we have the y-axis of impacts and temperature increases. On the x-axis, we have time. The red dotted line shows the threshold above which we have the danger level for cascading impacts and hothouse Earth or runaway warming. We're already most likely above that line, in that real danger zone. We have the current path there that we're on, the black line. We need to go fast to emissions. Even if we could click our fingers today, we still be above the danger threshold, most likely because there's so much heat already in the system. So then we need to suck down all the excess carbon dioxide. That takes about a century. That takes a long time. And so we're still above the danger zone. So we need this band-aid in the meantime of active cooling to get below and or stay below that threshold. We need to do these things simultaneously. It's not a staged process, it's an all-at-once process. Just a bit on reduce. Obviously, this means zero or near zero across all sectors, not just our stationary energy and transport, also construction, consumption, land use, etc. And of course, this means stopping and phasing out fossil fuels, including our exports, and preventing and phasing out sources of methane release, very importantly, because it's such, it's 100 times more potent a greenhouse gas than CO2. On the drawdown side, of course, we want to use all those natural means available to us. But it's important to sort of think, well, that probably won't be enough on its own, because emissions were released when those ecosystems were destroyed in the first place. We've also got the additional emissions from burning fossil fuels for all these decades, centuries. So we need to facilitate urgent R&D into direct air capture of greenhouse gases and use those ones currently available to us. And we're not talking about offsets here. We're not talking about drawdown in lieu of emissions reductions. We're talking about simultaneous action. Now, onto the third R. This chart gives a nice illustration of what we're talking about. We're talking about, in most cases, for repair, the third R, we're talking about active cooling, solar radiation management, making the earth more reflective. So if we, you can do it really up high in space. This is all, a lot of this is just completely theoretical. Up in space with sunshades or mirrors, using stratospheric aerosols, right down to the ground level, whitening roofs, lightening the colour of crops. I've also heard studies of how much of the earth we would need to cover with mirrors to reflect the appropriate amount of heat. Really pertinently, we are already creating 0.4 degrees to 1.5 degrees of cooling by burning fossil fuels, because burning fossil fuels releases aerosols into the stratosphere that reflect heat. So we're already doing this. It's really important to understand what it means going forward. If we went to zero today, we would see that cooling drop and our temperature would jump. So for repair, what the Climate Rescue Accord is asking for is urgent R&D and international cooperation in the area of immediate cooling. We need to find out what is safe. Is it safe or not? We need to at least research this very quickly. So we need to do it to compensate for the loss of the aerosol masking effect as we reduce fossil fuel emissions. And we will most likely need additional cooling until reduce and remove can achieve a safe climate on their own. So noting that there are many calls from a few corners for a moratorium on real-world research into solar radiation management. And these calls are coming from NGOs, environmental NGOs. They're coming from some climate scientists. And the arguments against using solar radiation management are the potential side effects, which are pretty serious potentially. And because there's no international governing body for solar radiation management. And quite importantly, it would reduce the incentive for zero emissions if global warming was no longer seen as an immediate threat. So just to reiterate, why do we need R&D into repair active cooling? Because of the aerosol masking effect, because as we go to zero, temperatures will jump. We are already too hot. The impacts from current warming are unacceptable. The death and destruction is unacceptable. We need to stop it. And that we were, in 2023, we were at 1.48 degrees above of average warming, you know, round up to 1.5. And we are at the threshold of runaway warming at 1.5 degrees. So we're already seeing those positive feedback loops speeding up warming. There is no time to lose. What does the IPCC say about solar radiation management? So it's really can be summed up by the positions of two different climate scientists really well, and it was summed up in a conversation article recently, which I'll post the link. This is Michael Mann. He is very big in the IPCC. He says net zero by 2050 with steep initial cuts is adequate to stop warming. And then we have James Hansen. If you're above 50, you will remember, you know, David Spratt just talked about James Hansen. If you are above 50, you might remember him presenting to US Congress about global warming back in 1988. That's when I first became really aware of global warming. So this conversation article, the disagreement between two climate scientists that could decide our future, linked there. They, what's happening? The question that the climate scientists that wrote this conversation article pose is reducing new emissions and permanently reducing past emissions enough on its own to prevent warming from reaching levels that threaten our economic and social stability? Michael Mann would say yes. James Hansen says while doing the first two R's, reduce and remove, are essential, they are no longer sufficient, and we also must make Earth more reflective. And then to the question, how much cooling are fossil fuel aerosols causing? Michael Mann says 0.4 degrees of cooling. So Michael Mann is embedded in IPCC orthodoxy, and it, you know, with the models that they are using. And James Hansen says we are creating up to 1.5 degrees of cooling. And he also says that recent changes in aerosols will cause a strong increase in warming. He said that back in, I think, 2020, in relation to the drops in, you know, the shipping industry was cleaned up. We saw a huge drop in their aerosols, and he saw that was going to be cause for accelerated warming. So the Accord scope of work, the Climate Rescue Accord, you know, we've talked, what are we trying to do? We're trying to get other political players to adopt the 3 Rs. And we're talking about grassroots, environmental NGOs, candidates, sitting MPs. And we want to engage those that have endorsed the 3 Rs to develop commensurate policy to underpin the 3 Rs, not just tick it off and then not really spruik what's required. And we also want to recognise political players that endorse the 3 Rs. Before I go any further, I'm going to spruik our Climate Rescue Accord workshop. That's this Wednesday, the 28th, at from 7:30 to 9:30 Melbourne time, and you can book at the sustainabilityfestival.au under searching for Climate Rescue Accord Working Group. And the workshop will compare what's required to stop and reverse warming against proposals from select parties and independents. It will also workshop how policy frameworks can be improved. So please come to that if you can. So back to the question, how do we get other political players endorsing and adopting the 3 Rs? For that, I am now going to hand over to Rob Bakes from Vote Climate One. We're really lucky to have Rob in our working group because he runs the Climate Traffic Light Voting Guide. This is really strategic for what the Climate Rescue Accord wants to achieve. So I will, so Rob, are you there?
Yep. Thanks, Barney. I'm ready to go.
Okay, cool.
Firstly, I I'd like to pay my respects to First Nations people, and in relation to where I live in central Victoria, to the Kulin Nation, the Tangarang and their elders. Australia needs minority government. This is a silver bullet for decisive government action and leadership on the climate emergency. This silver bullet has the potential to decimate the influence of bad actors like Woodside, Santos and the CFMEU. So where does Vote Climate 1 stand in relation to the 3 Rs? For our team, this big idea has the potential to give not just political parties, but the whole of the Australian collective an understanding of the essence of the climate crisis. It maps a clear pathway to what we need to do to rescue the climate. If we embrace its insight, we can stop arguing, put the merchants of doubt behind us, and collaborate with new hope and vigour. If we can accept the 3 Rs will guide us through what we have to do, all our energy can be channeled into how to get it done. This has always been the missing piece to the puzzle, how to create sufficient political will in Canberra to address the climate emergency. Traffic light voting is our contribution to help rectify a situation which has blocked progress for so long. Traffic light voting harnesses the power of preferential voting to create a new political paradigm which can further erode support for the major parties to the point where a progressive crossbench holds the balance of power in the lower house. In the ACT, the combined policies over many years of Labor and Greens minority governments is an example of what can be achieved. The ACT illustrates how minority government can deliver positive outcomes for climate. Amongst other substantive achievements, ACT is powered by 100% renewable energy. So what is traffic light voting? This video from the recent New South Wales state election should give you all an idea of the elegant simplicity of this advice to empower voters to elect the best available representatives for climate action.
Step 1 is to go to the front page of voteclimate1.org.au and find your electorate. To illustrate how this works, I'm going to click on L and then Lismore. Hey presto, up comes the Lismore electorate instructions on my screen. There are 3 buttons on the left of the screen to bring up the guides: View, Print and Download. I'm going to click on Print to print the upper house and lower house instructions. Okay, here's the Lismore guide I printed. Tells me there are 3 green light candidates, which I will number 1 to 3 in order of my choice. There is only 1 orange candidate, which I will number 4. Lastly, I will number the 4 red light candidates with the numbers 5 to 8. Okay, take these guides with you when you cast your vote, or take your phone with you and bring them up on the screen. The bonus which comes with traffic light voting, a safer future for Esther and Joseph. What do you think, Esther?
Vote Climate 1.
What do you think, Peppo?
Vote Climate 1.
Okay, thank you, Bryony. So here is a note on the Vote Climate 1 website in relation to the upcoming federal by-election in Dunkley, Victoria. Please note that the major parties have not been assessed on climate policy for their traffic light rating. We have ranked the Liberal candidate ahead of Labor to facilitate climate action through a push towards minority Labor government. This is not an indication that the Libs have a better climate policy than Labor. But if Labor can be pulled back to 72 or even 70 seats in the next federal election, the influence of a progressive crossbench could transform Australia's political landscape. A Labor win in Dunkley will only maintain rather than erode Labor's majority. Our traffic light assessment for the major parties will change depending on whether you happen to be voting in a marginal or safe seat. At this point, let's acknowledge the role of the Teals and community independents who have changed the culture of Australian politics. Their weakening of the coalition's parliamentary representation has strengthened Vote Climate One's hand when advising voters in a two-party contest. What can you do to help rescue our climate? At the last federal election, a small, under-resourced Vote Climate One team ran an on-the-ground campaign in the seat of Canberra. There was a hard copy mail-out, corflute advertising, and the distribution of traffic light voting guides at pre-polling and on election day itself. Despite the slim resources, the campaign did have a statistically measurable influence on the election result. I won't say we got David Pocock into the Senate, but we certainly helped with that. Lastly, I would like to introduce you to Kate the Climate Cat and her larrikin version of the 3 Rs. You can find her booklet in a slider on the front page of our website, voteclimate1.org.au. We also have hard copies available. Thank you, everyone.
Hey,
Thank you.
all right, we'll hand over to Mick now, who will do the Q&A. Please put any questions in the Q&A function.
And questions haven't arrived yet, so I'm thinking maybe we should just start with a question that we are very often asked, and which the group which was speaking from Finland earlier on also were asked, and that is the obvious question is, it's like, are we working for the fossil fuel industry here? It's a good excuse for the fossil fuel industry if we are successful with finding out how we can cool the planet in one way or the other, then that would just allow for the continuation of burning even more fossil fuels, wouldn't it? So, Adam, what would be your answer to that question? Isn't it just an excuse for the fossil fuel industry to continue what they're doing?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and one to be aware of when we pursue any of these actions, that we're not being captured or used by nefarious means. We're seeing similar things happening with denial of wind farms and solar farms, so certainly something to be aware of. But I suppose what we're saying is that this is a package that is required, a package of actions that are required all together. They are complementary, and they have to be delivered all together, or at least that we must have zero emissions immediately, as quickly as possible, draw down, and then we need to be seriously considering and doing R&D into cooling. As political parties and as legislators, if we get legislators into Parliament, then they can put in stipulations in policy saying that it's not possible to have cooling without those other commensurate actions. So definitely aware of this. I certainly am not a shill for the climate, for fossil fuel industries, and no one else on the team is. But it's something that we need to, as we move forward with these conversations, make very clear that these are 3 levers that we need to pull all together. It's not one or the other. In the same way that we can't reach a safe climate with just definitely not net zero, but even full zero, we can't do the same with just cooling. Cooling is a short-term action to help us achieve safe passage through to a safe climate.
So we have a question here from Jenny. As we're coming up to the next federal election, what guarantee is there that the crossbenchers will be pro the climate accord and climate action? Over to you, Rob, to that one.
What guarantee? Well, that's a good question. We want them to sign on to the accord, and we do a very thorough assessment, especially of independence. And I think they've proved in the current parliament, in the Senate, what a wonderful influence they've got. Imagine if they actually had the balance of power. So when we say progressive crossbench, we're not talking about those red light parties. We're talking about green light parties and green light candidates.
Another question, I think we'll stay with you, Rob, on this one. And this is a question about disinformation, as it's seen already in the Dunkley by-election. How can we counter for instance, the Advance Australia dissemination of disinformation? This is from Bronwyn.
Well, I suppose when you do as we did in Canberra, we did an on-ground, we did a hard copy mail out to every household in the Canberra election. And that nailed a lot of those things. And a lot of people say, no one wants to use paper anymore. But sometimes to cut through the noise, I think we may have to use paper as well. So when we assess candidates, we say red light candidates are dangerous. That's how we describe them. So whatever disinformation they're putting out, we're telling the voters it's dangerous to vote for these people. Make sure you preference the green and the orange light candidates before that. And remember, there are voters that won't listen to candidates and who won't listen to the propaganda, as they see it, from candidates because it's so egotistical. But when we put something out and we're not saying who to put first even. We're not even telling them which numbers. We're just saying who to preference before the others. I think a lot of people we found in Canberra, we got a lot of feedback that people were so grateful to have something that was a little arm's length from the fight, the electorate fight.
Here's one for you, Baroni, and that's about another party that's going to be very active in the next election, the Greens. How do the Greens stand on this accord everything we've talked about here, geoengineering and the rest of these questions, and has the Greens been approached by this working group?
Yep. So we started the accord started in June 2023. In September, we ran our inaugural live stream, and David Spratt presented at that, and there was a presentation and panel discussion that was really good. We invited the crossbench. We invited every registered party. It was hard to know who actually attended. I don't know if any Greens attended. We haven't reached out. Other than that, we haven't reached out specifically to the Greens other than conversations with people I know are Greens members and so on, and asked them to get on board and join us. I know, look, the Greens are big. There's really a broad, as in any party, there's lots of opposing opinions on all different things within the Greens. I do know of specific voices in the Greens that are anti the third R. I'm sure there are people in the Greens that are pro the third R and the whole package of the 3 Rs. I think we definitely need to do a lot more targeted education, and on the back of this, we will be reaching out to different parties. We have a few parties in the wings coming to join us, which is really exciting. So we'll be reaching out to the Greens specifically, and if there are any Greens members or Greens representatives that happen to be listening, please get in touch.
So I have a question here for you, Adam, and then afterwards over to Antoinette. This one is about aerosol active cooling. It's Rock who's asking, these techniques are inherently uncertain, especially at the global scale. For instance, the risk of collapse of the South Asian monsoon from this kind of sulfate brightening. So can you talk a little bit about the risks when we talk about the aerosols, Adam?
Yeah, and I think the previous session did a really great job of describing the risk profiles of different techniques, and that risk is not static, that we must balance the risk of action against the risk of inaction. So I think the conversation needs to be had within that context. And thanks for the question, Rod, because it's a really good one. For the climate rescue accord, what we're saying is that we need to have R&D into all types of techniques, and that includes those various ways of reflecting radiation from Earth, and including, the solar mirrors, which is maybe a bit far-fetched, although I did see something recently where a country was planning something in that regard. The stratospheric aerosol injection, which is often talked about a lot, all the way down to lightening Earth's surface. And this is already being done in some places where, I think in California, they have lightened roads to get a localized cooling effect. All of those things come within the conversation of repair, of cooling. And I think what's happened in the conversation to this point is that stratospheric aerosol injection has been presented as all of the options for solar radiation management, or they've been conflated together. So whenever we talk about solar radiation management, people are actually, and people are getting sort of very worried about that. They're often meaning they're worried about solar aerosol, stratospheric aerosol injection, which I think is a valid concern. So I think first I would like to say that we need to have a more nuanced discussion of all of the technologies, and that if you're someone that doesn't really vibe with stratospheric aerosol injection, I imagine, I believe there's going to be parties that also take that position. What we're trying to get happen in the conversation is that we start talking about repair and cooling as an action that we need to definitely think about and do research into and act on if the research suggests that it will help us get to a safe climate. But parties will differ in which approaches they will support, for instance. So you might agree with whitening of roads and roofs, and that means that you're good for repair. That's a repair action, but you're not into stratospheric aerosol injection. So you go for the party that is supporting those sorts of actions. This is where we get the political competition, right? But we're hoping that all parties eventually come on board saying that we at least need reduction, removal, and repair. They need to be the details in that can be a political conversation. In terms of the particular question you've got about aerosol injection being dangerous, I think that there certainly needs to be far more research into this. And if it doesn't lead to a safe climate, or it has too high risks, then we wouldn't support it. That's my position. But if we find that the risk profile of not acting is worse than the risk profile of acting, then we need to have that discussion. And one of the reasons that we think that this is really important is because we are already in a very unsafe climate. Part of the Animal Justice Party, we have seen species go extinct because of climate change. In Australia, the first mammalian species gone extinct in Australia, in the world, was in Australian territory from climate change. We see there's bats in Australia that have had 30% of their populations die in 2 days. We are already in crisis. Animals, ecosystems, people, we need every action that we can to get to a safe climate. And we believe that repair is part of that action set.
Antoinette, can you describe what does the accord, the Climate Rescue Accord, mean for a political party and the process of creating a climate policy and so on? So a little bit on the positive side, maybe in describing how has the Climate Rescue Accord helped the Australian progressives with your climate policy?
So I actually think the Climate Rescue Accord is actually very empowering for the voters, for just people to, as Rob Bakes is talking about with his traffic light system, it just helps people who know and recognise what dire straits we are actually in to be able to identify who they need to get into power, who they need to take out of power in order for change to happen. And at the moment, it's a matter of having to sift through every individual party's policies to have a look at what's happening. And also, we've got preferential voting. So you need to be voting for more than one party. You need to number all your boxes. And you don't want to be accidentally putting a party who you may agree with their other policies, but they're actually not very good for the environment. So by having this climate accord, it is a very easy way for people to work out, are you with the climate accord? Yes, cool. All right, you're in my preferences. Very easy for people and very empowering. And it's the way we're going to get change to happen. I mean, we're all screaming, we're going on the streets, we're trying to get things happening. But unless there's people up in the decision-making factory that are going to listen, nothing is going to change. And so hopefully by seeing that parties can work together and acknowledge, yeah, this is like the minimum that we need to happen in order to save our environment, that is what's going to get us across the line and get changes happening and help us have a safe future.
Thank you. We have more questions coming in. So here's one from Peter. What are your strategies for getting the major environmental NGOs on board with cooling? At present, organizations like ACF and the Climate Council are resisting any discussion about solar radiation and so on. Over to you, Bryony.
Thanks, Mick, and great question. We have made initial attempts. We weren't expecting them to be successful, and they weren't successful. My sense is with the environmental NGOs, the big ones in Australia, they're not leaders. We saw with the climate emergency declaration, they fought the use of the word emergency. The first declaration was in 2016. That was Darebin Council. It slowly took off around the world. It was not until hundreds of councils had declared that those ENGOs then went and quietly, that they jumped on the bandwagon and tried to shape it to their, they sort of jumped on the bandwagon and grabbed the reins. So they will, I think it's sort of an operation, you know, that large environmental NGOs, the grassroots do a lot of work, and then the environmental NGOs sort of say, okay, we'll fund this, we'll help with this, and we'll sort of appear to be taking the lead on this. That's a very cynical view, but that's what I've seen happen. And I don't expect buy-in from any of the environmental NGOs anytime soon.
Although, can I jump in there,
Sure.
Bryony, and just say, I think this is also, Peter, part of that disentangling of the conversation about cooling and having a more nuanced discussion. There was a recent article in the conversation by Tim Flannery, who's part of the Climate Council, I believe, and they talk, and it was basically, yeah, we need to go zero emissions. And it was good to see that they started talking about drawdown. We should be doing some drawdown, which is, you know, a movement in the discussion for some of the larger NGOs, unfortunately. And then saying quite strongly, we shouldn't be going the SRM route, right? But even within that article, there's a line that he says, which is like, we shouldn't be using solar radiation management, which I think he meant stratospheric aerosol injection. But then he said, but, you know, things like painting roofs white, they're fine. So actually, they do agree with cooling. some forms of cooling, some types of technology of cooling techniques that have a lower risk profile. So I think if we can sort of open the conversation, like actually push the conversation, force them to join the conversation and have this more nuanced discussion, we can really open up that discussion and say, well, yes, we all agree that repair is necessary, but we differ on how we think that repair should occur. And that's where then we can really push for the research. All of this stuff should be done based on ethical and scientific justification.
And can I just add to that, you know, never underestimate the importance of, as you're saying, Adam, of pushing a discussion. I think, if anything, that we can say that we achieved with this campaign that we started in 2016 and which has been running now for 7 years, about the fact that you could declare a climate emergency, and something that has then been done by 2,300 councils and also governments around the world and so on. Maybe the most important of it all was the introduction of the word emergency, which has now become the way we talk about climate. Climate change has been replaced by climate emergency all over, in media, mainstream, everywhere. So that has pushed the discussion. And I think the Climate Accord has that potential as well to push the discussion so that we begin to talk about the realities as we see them. We're getting close. There are 4 minutes left till we have to end. I was thinking maybe if anyone from our group would like to just say a few words, like an invitation to that we would like people to come to our workshop. You mentioned that already, Bryony, but also that we are still on the lookout for people who would like to join us in this work, in the work group and so on. Bryony, over to you.
Yeah, and I just want to say, we haven't really pointed out, we are different political parties working together. This is kind of rare, and it's a great, it's a great collaboration. We work so positively together, and we're bringing our parties along with us, and we want others to join us. So please come and join us.
And I'd add to that that there was a question earlier around how do we deal with misinformation, and there's some really great science and evidence around both inoculating people against misinformation, but also debunking, but requiring those two things in conjunction for any sort of good protection against misinformation. And coming on board and helping out with just writing some stuff or creating some posters and flyers and things that we can start to actually push this out, that people, if they're going to their political party, can grab some resources to use. At the moment, we're 4 or 5 people, and it's a fair amount of work, but we can always use hands for that sort of stuff. And then, of course, definitely get in touch, come to the workshop if you are interested in thinking about how to get your the party you're involved with, or the local ENGO that you're involved with, or any other group or of people that you're involved with on board. We'll be sort of thinking about how do you go through that process. We've done that with our own parties so far, and so we're wanting to try and facilitate that for more organisations and political parties.
Antoinette?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go out there, talk to your representatives, ask them, are you with the Climate Accord? Have you signed on? Have you talked to them? If they haven't, ask them why not. Get them involved. We all need to work together to get this happening. It's past the tipping point now. We have to get in there repairing. I'm not willing to accept for my kids, oh, we've damaged the environment a little bit, but you can live with it. I want to repair it. I want to get it back to a livable, comfortable environment and get our ecosystems back up and functioning how they were meant to be happening. So yeah, come along and join us. Make the jobs easier for us by spreading out the work.
Great. And Rob, just for a very short, brief comment.
Yeah, I'm just going to mention Kate the Climate Cat, because a lot of people are daunted by all this sort of very intellectual stuff. Grab onto Kate. She's written a booklet and it's got cartoons in it. It's a sort of like a comic strip, but it has this same message. So if you want to do something, get Kate out there in trains, on train stations, everywhere. Let's get Kate out there telling people about climate rescue.
Thank you. That's all from the Climate Rescue Accord Working Group. We hope to see you again. This is about not accepting the damage that's happening, in front of our eyes every day when we open the news. It's about not being indifferent and to try and protect what we believe is important. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, folks.
Checking in with comms. Can people hear me? Thumbs up. Thank you.
You're muted, Adrian. Oh.
Me? What's the, how do you get the climate background up? Hey, how do I get that climate background up? What's that?
G'day, folks.
Sally's got it. Dale's got it. What have you got to do in settings to get the background? Background. Sally, Trent, Dale, do you know how you get that nice looking climate background that you've got up just with your heads?
Hey, Adrian, have a look in the chat. Okay, so welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for sticking with us for this last part of the mini summit. My name is Sally McAdams, and I'm the coordinator of Climate Emergency Australia. Over the next hour, we're going to be talking about reclaiming the climate emergency. Before we get into that, though, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm joining from the lands of the Wurundjeri people today, and whether you're joining from Melbourne or Victoria or around Australia, we're all joining from unceded Aboriginal land. And I'd like to thank the elders of all those First Nations for looking after this country for such a long time. So today we're going to unpack what council mobilisation could look like and how to get your council into climate emergency mode. And this forum is a little bit of a precursor to the Climate Emergency Conference coming up in the middle of the year. We have a council-focused conference coming in April and a community-focused conference coming in June. And the theme of those conferences is also reclaiming the climate emergency. And you can find out more about those at our website. Next slide, please. So just in case you haven't come across Climate Emergency Australia before, we are a network of councils around Australia who have declared a climate emergency. And our role is to build the capacity of the local government sector to respond to the climate emergency and to act as a collective voice for all of those declared councils. And if you'd like to know more about our organisation or get in touch, you can do so via the details on screen now. And we're going to be joined today by 5 speakers who are all experts in climate emergency mobilisation, particularly at the local government level. And I'll introduce each one as we go. But first, just to give you a very brief bit of background context. So as has been mentioned many times today, it was back in the end of 2016 that Darebin City Council moved the very first climate emergency declaration in the world. And since then, we've had more than 2,000 jurisdictions around the world declare, and that's nations, subnational governments and municipalities. And if you'd like to check the full list and the breakdown, do go and check out the SEDAMIA website that's on screen now. That's definitely the best place to find all the up-to-date information. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in Australia, we've had, we've had 115 councils declare, as well as the South Australian Government and the ACT, which is pretty amazing. Next slide, please. Of those 115 councils, 40 of those have joined Climate Emergency Australia. And if you want to check out to see whether your council is a member or has declared, you can check the SEDAMIA website and check the Climate Emergency Australia website. Next slide, please. Actually, we'll stop sharing now. Thank you. So I guess just to talk a little bit about these last 7 years or so, it's been a really exciting time to be working in climate in local government. We've had a lot of hope that local government would sort of provide the blueprint for state and federal government to go into climate emergency mode and fully mobilise our whole society. And there's absolutely no doubt that all of these declarations around the world and here in Australia have accelerated action on global warming at the local government level. However, to date, as far as we know, there's been no council who's really cracked the nut of going into full climate emergency mode. And that's one of the reasons that we're here today, and that's one of the reasons for being of Climate Emergency Australia. We want to help councils to do that. So the question we're asking today is, what could full mobilisation really look like? How can it help us rescue the climate and save the world? So no pressure on our speakers, but if you do have some questions, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A, so not the chat, but the Q&A, or save them to the end and stick up your hand and we'll get to you then. We'll have about 15 to 20 minutes for that Q&A. But without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Adrian Whitehead. He's one of the directors at CASE, that's Council and Community Action in the Climate Emergency. And Adrian's going to tell us a little bit about the goals of CASE in terms of full emergency mobilisation across all of society to reverse global warming, and about the vital role that councils can play in that mobilisation, and how councils can step into that leadership role from wherever they are at the moment. So I'll hand over now to you, Adrian.
Thanks, Sally. It's great to be here. I'm just going to share my screen and share the presentation I've got set up. And it's, here we go. So, slideshow, and we're away. So as you'd all know, and if you've been fortunate enough to get to the previous speakers, that we're looking at a really serious situation now. We're in a climate catastrophe. We're sort of heading into a climate collapse. And unless we get our emissions down below that zero line, where things are going to get worse. And we saw in earlier talks today that we're not looking at doing that for a very, very long time. So we can expect if we don't act quite soon, that the things that we're seeing now are just going to get worse and worse and get to a really critical stage. So we don't want to go there. So how are we going to not go there? That's really the question. The challenge for us is that we've got a whole lot of politicians that are currently heavily influenced by the fossil fuel industries one way or another. Even in Victoria, we've been expanding our offshore gas when we should be reducing our emissions. And nationally, we certainly got some issues around federal parliament on both sides of politics with significant gas and coal expansions going on. So how can we crack this? What's the theory of change? What's going to be the conduit to get our state and federal governments into emergency mode? And one really exciting opportunity is one that we've used before, and we've talked about it earlier through Sally was talking about it with the climate emergency campaigns, is our local councils. And so this is a bunch of local councillors. It happens to be the very local councillors who declared, they were the first government in the world to declare a climate emergency. Okay, so from that, this bunch of people here, we started a global movement. We changed global discourse, and we've actually created a movement, despite it being started from literally a handful of grassroots activists in a single council. And just saying that, it did say in my introduction, says there on my name that I do work for a council, but obviously in this particular presentation, in no way am I representing the council I work for, because that's just not allowed. So, and you can see here, we've got this situation where that emergency declaration has spread around the world and had changed global discourse effectively. So can we repeat that? Can we repeat that in terms of getting action at a government level that will start that process of reversing global warming? And I think we can. So we know we need all our governments to get into an emergency mode. We need to do it now. Can a council initiate an emergency response? That's one of the questions that we get often asked. And the simple answer is yes. And we know this for a couple of reasons. Mainly we know it because we had COVID. Every single council around Australia, to some degree, went in emergency mode. They changed the front page of their website. They moved staff from one job to another. They closed public-facing offices, etc., etc., etc. In this particular case at Darebin, they've just announced $10 million package, to fund and stimulate economic growth within that just one little council. So we did it for COVID. A lot of the examples we could get councils to do are simple COVID examples, and we can do it again. If one council somewhere in the world went into full emergency mode, the rest would start to follow. And we would, like a set of dominoes, just like we succeeded in doing with the Climate Emergency Declaration campaign. We got our first council, we got our second council, we got a third council. We convinced the American campaigners to do it, and then it took off around the world. So on our case website, we've pretty much got all you need to know. So we've got everything from how to build a community campaign and what the emergency mobilisation looks like. So I'm just going to dive into that, particularly the bit around what the emergency mobilisation looks like, because other speakers who are coming after me are going to be presenting on how to get some of that mobilisation, that community work, and how to work with councillors and that sort of thing. So let's have a look at what emergency mobilisation might look like. One of the first things you've got to go is, what are you trying to set up to get emergency mobilisation to start? And I've got these 5 key things that you'll need. You'll need to get a majority of your councillors on side with an emergency mobilisation of war. So at emergency speed. You'll need to get the CEO on side. The CEOs run councillors. Councils are like an executive board or a board of a company. They only do the strategic planning. They've got some specific roles that they have to do, but the bottom line is the CEO runs the business effectively. You're going to have a council with the climate and communication teams on board because they're going to be critical to rolling out both your messaging around the climate emergency and the actions that you're doing to mitigate and become resilient to it. You're going to have a council with functioning systems. So some councils just, for whatever reason, you know, maybe their website team doesn't work or it just takes too long to make a decision. So you're going to have to work with a council that's got that. And none of that's going to happen unless you've got a strong community campaign. All right. So what does emergency mobilisation look like? It starts with acknowledgement of the climate emergency. You'd then look inwards and you'd build an internal knowledge base amongst the staff and the executive. The executive, as well as the CEO, would need to get buy-in. You need to get buy-in. You develop a new climate emergency plan that reflected emergency mobilisation rather than just a sort of better than business as usual climate response that we would have now. It would have to be a communications priority because this is what councils do worst. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And community mobilisation is once the council's in this mode, they're encouraging their community to mobilise themselves. You do a whole of council review and you can do an emergency budgeting exercise. Councils do exercise where they put their budgets back to zero and every line item and every staff member needs to you know, justify their position. And we would do something similar, but with an emergency frame. You make it the number one priority and then you go about helping the council, helping everyone get to negative. Once you go down that road, there's amazing things you can do. You can work in all sorts of areas, and some of the later speakers will talk a little bit more about this, but you know, it's everything from walking and cycling to supporting uptake of EVs within your council, which actually saves the council money. You're building resilience in your community, reducing heat island effects and deaths, encouraging community food resilience. It just goes on and on and on. And Dale's got some great stuff about that in his piece of work, the Local Government Climate Emergency Toolkit. And councils can play a key role in reversing global warming. We can draw down doing things like biochar, planting trees, putting vegetation back in the ground, building soil carbon, and we can do some solar reflection. As you know, if you just that picture says it all. It's do we want black roofs or do we want white roofs and light coloured roads? It's really that simple. And just one little slide to finish off. This slide just shows the difference between a current way we think about emissions, the blue is the current way we calculate it, and if we build in what methane actually does in terms of the here and now of warming, you can see that the agriculture, the waste sector have much more impact than we currently calculate. So thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Adrian. Thanks, Adrian. It's been great to hear from somebody who's been there from the very start. And I'd like to give an extra thank you to Adrian because he's the person who's brought together and coordinated the session today. And next we're going to go to Bryony Edwards. We've already heard from her today. She's one of the directors of CASE as well. And she's going to talk a little bit about how we can use the upcoming council elections towards the end of this year in Victoria to drive council's climate emergency agendas and how it can help get councils into climate emergency mode. Thanks, Bryony.
Thanks a lot, Sally. I'm just going to share my screen, hopefully successfully. So as Sally said, I'm going to talk about using elections, which are a very strategic time to leverage a council into emergency mode because all of the candidates are listening to the community like they do at no other time. So just going back, Adrian already shared this map, but, you know, here's the result of the butterfly wings. So 2,355 governments around the world recognising the climate emergency because of the butterfly wings of Darebin Council saying we recognise the climate emergency, and then the groups that say, you know, took that to other councils and said, now why don't you do the same, and took that around the world. So what's your strategy? So if you want to get your council to mobilise, do you want to run as a candidate to do it? Do you want to set up work with an existing local group to lobby and pressure the candidates at election time? Or do you want to do both? If you want to do both, you probably need to separate yourself from a group that might be working on this, so there's not such a conflict of interest. But we talk about both, you know, running as a candidate or working with a candidate and being with a community group. So you might, if you're not already with a group, you might want to join one, like so many councils have a climate action network. There might be a Voices of group, Transition Street groups, local Facebook community groups, or you could have significant impact with yourself if you just have a few others to work with and can bring others on board. And you want to, most groups still don't understand the why and how of emergency mobilisation. This is really, unfortunately, but it's the case. So you can see the case website and get in touch with us if you need some help on that. That's caseonline.org. So that's getting your group into an emergency frame. So they're thinking big picture. So if you are running as a candidate, you've got to think about what your objective is. Do you want to get elected? Maybe you just want to educate the councillors and the community and influence the election outcome. And back in 2016, both Adrian and I ran as climate emergency candidates in Darebin. We just spruiked the climate emergency. We just spruiked what council should be doing. Neither of us won council, but I think that us running was key in talking to the other candidates and saying, look, this could work. You might want to do both. If you want to get elected, in most councils, you would need to do more than just talk about the climate emergency. If you just want to educate councillors and the community, you can just talk about the climate emergency and what council can do. Now, because we have preferential voting in Australia, this sort of changes the way elections happen, because when you run as a candidate, you speak with other candidates about, you know, where am I going to put you in my preferences? You know, I'll put you number 2 if you can tell me what you understand about the climate emergency and convince me that you properly understand it and that you're going to do something for council. So that's great leverage. The candidates talk to each other in most cases. It makes a huge difference to sharing ideas. If you run as a candidate, you can also educate the community because you can door knock, and elections are one time of the year. You can ignore no junk mail stickers and put anything in the letterbox because the ALP and the LNP made it so. Other campaign tools, you can talk to candidates as a candidate yourself or as a community group. When you talk to other candidates, link climate emergency action to something the candidate cares about, such as family, nature, lowering rates, whatever. A really good lever is highlighting the irresponsibility of council not prioritising climate. And there's lots of work that's come out in the last few years on the liability of council, and Sarah Barker from Minter Ellison law firm has done a lot of this work for Australian councils. There's a case blog, Financial Risk for Councils Burying Their Head in the Drying Ground, that summarises a lot of this work. So it's great to be sort of full bottle on that before you talk to candidates. You can also explain the positive financial benefits of very strong climate action, and Dale Martin will talk more about that with his toolkit. You can also, it's great if you have a local a local climate action network that can survey candidates on their climate emergency understanding or positions and then publish the results, such as with a traffic light kind of voting systems. And these questions, the survey can educate the candidates. What percentage of canopy cover would they argue for? Do they support initiatives to help get homes and businesses off gas, transitioning the fleet to electric? What do they propose for building community resilience? And do they support council undertaking emergency mobilisation? And you also want someone, a group, your group or a group in the area should make sure there's a candidate forum, ideally climate focused, and probably a webinar, maybe live. And it should start with a shock and awe climate talk, such as David Spratt might present, and talk about what councils can do to educate the community, have the right questions prepared, and make sure a recording goes live and is promoted, well promoted. And I think that's it from me.
Great. Thank you so much, Bryony. Thanks for illuminating some of those political opportunities and tools available to us. Okay, so up next, we're going to have Trent McCarthy. Trent is a councillor at Darebin City Council. And yes, he's the very same councillor who moved that world first climate emergency declaration. He's going to tell us a little bit about some of the hurdles facing councillors in terms of going into climate emergency mode and the role that community members can play in supporting councillors to make that shift. Thank you, Trent.
Thanks, Sally, and thanks everyone for joining us. And I'd also just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land who I'm on today, which is the Wurundjeri Wurrung people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And also recognise, and I think this is important in this conversation, also recognise the significance of First Nations knowledge and caring for country, which is absolutely essential when we talk about what our climate emergency response is, to do that in alignment with that commitment to that recognition. Because people have lived in this place for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, and they've lived very well. And I think it's worth us bringing that to the centre of our conversation when we talk about the climate emergency. So what I wanted to focus on is actually first to tell you the hard stuff, and then I'm going to tell you the happy stuff. The hard stuff falls into a few categories. So I want to share with you a little bit about the limitations that local councillors actually have. And I've experienced this. I've been a local councillor. This is my 16th year. It's my final year. So, and I say that because one of the things that's really important is to understand what councillors actually do is that they commit to a period of time. So in my fourth term of four-year terms, and in a 4-year term, a councillor can achieve a few things, hopefully, if they can win the support of the rest of their colleagues. In order to do that, they need to get that commitment or those commitments engaged in the council plan early on. And in order to do that, they need to be able to demonstrate to other councillors and hopefully to the rest of the organisation that those are things that people can get behind as well. So to get anything through a council chamber, you need a majority vote. So if you've got 9 councillors, which is what I've experienced at Darebin, that means that if there are 9 people there, you need to get at least 5 of them voting for that thing. Now, why that's important is that it may not be the councillor themselves who's driving climate emergency action on their own, who is the one who is most well equipped to influence their colleagues. It may in fact be other community members. And this is why the best campaigns that I've seen in that 16 years on council have been the ones where I've been able to work really closely with the climate action groups, like the groups that Bryony mentioned before, or advocates who've put pressure on me and also applied pressure on other councillors to help them understand why it's so important to get behind this initiative or that initiative. And that's not just in relation to the climate emergency, it's in relation to anything. So it's really important, first of all, to understand that in Victoria and in most states around the country, states and territories, individual councillors have no individual power. All of the power that they have and all the decision-making roles that they have are collective. Councillors don't have their own budgets, except for a couple of jurisdictions around Australia, and with the exception of some Lord Mayors. So most councillors can't say, I'm going to do this thing and spend money on this thing. They actually need to win the support of a majority of their council. But even then, even if you do win the support of a majority of your council, you need to make sure that that item or that commitment you've made through the council chamber, through a vote, is actually implemented. And that's where the hard work begins. It's actually about making sure that you have a persistent and consistent approach to engaging with the organisation. Adrian mentioned before that councillors are elected. They are like the executive or the board of management, and it's actually the chief executive officer and their staff who implements the council's decisions. So when we made our climate emergency declaration back in December 2016, it was the 5th of December 2016, We actually didn't know what that meant in the reality of our council implementing a climate emergency declaration and seeking to move into a climate emergency mode. We had to go through that process of understanding and unpacking that. Every council that has declared a climate emergency should have gone through that process. That's the idea. You make your declaration and then you delve deep and understand, what does this mean for us? And it means a little bit different for different councils. So one of the first things that I would encourage anyone to think about who is thinking about trying to either get their council, which is already declared, to move into emergency mode, is to encourage councillors to start having that conversation with their administration. How are we going? What's happening? What has the council done? And not do it in a way that is shifting blame or accusing, but rather being curious. Because one of the challenges that we have in this space is that because it hasn't happened anywhere yet, because no local government anywhere in the world, as far as we know, has shifted into that emergency mode, it is very difficult to actually point to an example to say, why haven't you done what this council has done? Because we don't have that example, and that's what we're searching for. But what we do have are examples of councils working at speed, at pace, and in a collaborative and collective way to make a huge impact. And I want to share with you an example of that. So in Darebin's climate emergency plan, which was the first climate emergency plan that had been developed anywhere, one of the commitments that was made was a commitment to shift the council's operations to 100% renewable energy. Now, Darebin made the commitment to say, if we are going to do this, why wouldn't we also ask every other council to join us on that journey? And why wouldn't we do the work to actually work out how we can do that? As a result, that led to the creation of what's now called VECO, the Victorian Energy Collaboration, which involves over 50 councils pooling their renewable energy consumption together and effectively shifting and moving together. One of the great things about that was that when we were aware that a council might not be moving to join this buyers group of renewable energy, we were able to encourage their climate action groups to apply pressure upwards. And that meant that councils, in some cases, had declared a climate emergency or hadn't, but hadn't taken any significant action. So this was the first action that they took, which was to shift to 100% renewables. That's now the largest emissions reduction project of local government anywhere in Australia, in Australian history. And that's an example of going into emergency mode in relation to where you get your power from. So my big belief is that if we can understand what are those points of influence and who do we need to talk to, then we can actually help those people make change and make those shifts. One of the great things about local governments and local councillors is that you can find out who they are. It's all there on the website. You can generally bring them up. It's the most accessible level of government. And importantly, they have a responsibility to you as a constituent. That doesn't mean they have to agree with what you've got to say, but they have to give you the time, and they have to listen to what you've got to say, particularly if you can demonstrate that you actually have a connection to others in your community. So my first suggestion is, if you're interested in doing this, make contact with your local councillor and have a conversation with them. Be curious and ask them to be curious about what is possible. If they've declared a climate emergency, if the council has, what have they done? What could they do? And what are they going to pursue? And that conversation can sometimes lead to them picking that thing up, running with it, and having a go. Sally, I'm conscious of time, so I'll probably go for one more minute if that's okay, which is really just to say the critical thing is to understand that the drivers of policy decisions and big decisions in local government are people just like you and me. They're local residents who became councillors. So they're not at the big end of town. They're generally people who have come from your own community, and therefore there's already a connection there. And if you are seeing the impacts of the climate emergency in your own community, then talk to your local councillors about that. So a good example is if you're seeing the degradation of a local park due to the weather impacts, talk about that as something that matters to you, because that will actually connect with them. And then ask them what can they do about it in terms of their council's emergency mode. So I'll end it there and looking forward to some questions later on.
Great. Thank you so much, Trent. Thank you for that insight into the inner workings of councils and how we can support that shift into climate emergency mode. All right, so up next we have Tiffany Harrison. Tiffany is the coordinator of a climate alliance, and she was the world's first climate emergency officer. She's going to be speaking about how resource-constrained councils can engage with the climate emergency movement. Over to you, Tiffany.
Thanks, Sally, and thanks for having me. Yeah, a bit like Trent, I would like to focus on some of the challenges, potentially a little bit more from the perspective of officers working within councils who are working really, really hard on climate policy, on enacting climate change, but have a lot of real limitations and resource constraints. So I've worked across a number of different councils in my time. I've also really passionate about the climate emergency. So worked a bit over a decade ago, 2013, we're looking at what does it mean or what could it mean for local governments to declare a climate emergency and really take that on in this work as a level of government that can really push that. So this is very exciting to see so many councils and now other jurisdictions around the world who have declared a climate emergency. But a question that I do get from resource constrained councils in regional areas, I guess in particular, is what does that really mean for our council? So they're already struggling with the workload or having small teams, often one person responsible for anything to do with sustainability. And now that's climate change, so that's a massive remit. So what does a climate emergency declaration mean in reality for the work that they do? How can it help them? How can it help their council? You know, when they're working as hard as possible. So a lot of councils, yeah, as I said, with limited staff resources, they're doing amazing work. But also council officers in particular that I speak with are really concerned about climate change. It's gone from a space of mitigation, it's still working in the mitigation space, but regional areas, I live out in Gippsland now and Gunai country, and there's been storms, fires. There's a lot of towns that were without power for about 5-6 days recently with the recent storms. And that's really hitting home to council officers who feel really responsible in the work that they do to be able to respond to this, to effectively plan for that, but with basically limited to no budget. So that is a real problem that we have. The councils, which are the council areas and the local areas and communities who are feeling the stress of the emergency most in Australia, are also the ones that have the limited and the least amount of resources to be able to respond to that. So obviously there are certain things that councils do. So, you know, I'm part of collectives across the state with the Victorian Greenhouse Alliances, and we work to do advocacy to be able to highlight that to different levels of government to support councils more in that space. Also aware that state government is also constrained. So I think that that's the real problem now, is that we have a whole bunch of councils who are really feeling the strain. We've got a bunch of councils who have declared a climate emergency, but we haven't seen that next level of action either. So either councils are at that stage doing lots of work, really, really struggling with what it means to the massive workload for them in their area and haven't declared, or the ones that have and taking, as Adrian was talking earlier, taking that next step up and actually going into climate emergency mode. From the declaration is one thing, but then fully shifting into, if we're actually treating it as a proper emergency, what does that mean for our council? So I guess there's no clear output except for more community support, very, very vocal community support for climate action, climate change, which leads through to councillors understanding that message, but also advocacy up to different levels of government to be able to provide that financial support that those councils need to do that work, and internally to be able to have, you know, those teams supported financially, and also with there are other levels of policy support and generally, you know, internal work and knowing that the directors and leadership teams really support that climate work. I think that's really important, but also community can be asking the questions of teams that are not just sustainability. So looking at emergency management teams, how do they work better together? So councils are starting to look at that holistic integration of work across all the levels of all the teams of council, and working better in that space. So yeah, I guess that's the main message I wanted to come through with, is that council officers are in it for the real fight, but really struggling at the moment, and the more community can support them and support councillors getting that message as well, I think that's really important.
Great. Thank you so much, Tiffany. I think that's a really timely reminder that councils are not all on the same playing field, and also they're having to deal with climate impacts alongside their climate emergency work. So thanks for that, Tiffany. Okay, so I'm now going to introduce Dale Martin. Dale is the author of the Local Government Climate Emergency Toolkit. We've heard that mentioned a few times before. He's a former councillor, and he's going to describe some of the key mechanisms for influencing councils and supporting broader climate mobilisation. Thanks, Dale.
Thanks very much. I will share my screen. Okay. Yeah, g'day everyone. As it's been alluded to a couple of times now. So back in 2020, at the end of my 4 years as a city councillor in the city of Merribeck, I authored a toolkit which is called the Local Government Climate Emergency Toolkit. It is a free resource for anyone to download. It has 46 actions in it, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The toolkit itself has been downloaded now over 15,000 times across 50 countries. And like I said, it's a free resource. There's a PDF version, and then due to popular demand, I created a Word version as well, so people can copy and paste a little bit easier. I should also say as well, so I work in sustainability. I've been working in energy and sustainability for the last 14 years as well. So one of the things that people sort of ask me quite a lot, particularly with the toolkit, is, where do I start? And in the context of building momentum, I think it's really important to start by actually centering yourself and starting somewhere. And I know that's probably not what a lot of people like to hear, and that people like a really set list to work their way through from A to Z, but it just doesn't work like that. Like was mentioned before, I mean, local governments are so diverse from the inner city all the way out to the regional areas, and then across different states. And I've had many conversations with what's a priority over in WA versus what's a priority in Tassie or Vic. You can get quite varied sort of local issues and importances. So when stepping through the toolkit and progressing on your climate compass, there's sort of 4 key areas to look at, and that is governance, energy, biodiversity, and waste. And so looking at building momentum, I really encourage people to take a step in any of the directions because you will find that people are passionate about certain areas. And the toolkit really has specific measurable and direct actions in each of these areas. So if you are particularly passionate about something, run with it, talk to your councillors, talk to your community. You can campaign on a single action, or you can campaign on a really effective full council climate emergency response plan. Again, being strategic. So here are a list of the 46 actions that are in the toolkit. Really, it's quite a lot, and particularly when I talk with council officers who are thinking about putting forward a climate emergency response plan, it is quite overwhelming. And so that's why I really encourage people to take steps in any direction and build that momentum internally, because once you have internal resources that can actually do additional work, that helps really inform the organisation and really focus on that culture, which is really, really key. Again, start at the basics. The toolkit has actions from 1-star, 2-star to 3-star. Start with 1-star, start with the areas that you're passionate about, and then progressively build from there. If you're a council that's lucky enough to have resources, to have councillors declare a climate emergency and then initiate a response plan, then you're able to really take more robust steps. And I'd be recommending something like looking at the actions here, looking at what some of the councils that are leading in this space are doing, and actually using them as a benchmark as well. So I wanted to really quickly finish by talking about stamina building. I think it's really important that when you're working in this space, it's a journey, and as frustrating as it is, not everyone understands the predicament that we're in, and so we really need to build stamina for the journey to bring others on board. The first one being making sure that you're sharing stories of success and looking to your peers, looking to your other councils for the great examples and the brilliant work that's happening. Understanding the motivations of your stakeholders. A number of different councils have quite varied councillor makeups, and also as well the senior executives and the CEO that work within a council. So it's really important to understand those stakeholders before you really commit to what you're asking for. The third point in there is to really support those working inside of a council. So if there are officers that are working, if there are councillors that are on board and are really trying to push this, celebrate the successes that they're able to achieve with the resources that they have. The fourth point is to really participate in community engagement. I can't tell you the number of times where we had a room full of people asking for us to commit to something, but then we couldn't even get a single response on a budget or a single response on a local plan. So I think it's really important to participate in that community engagement. And the final point as well, for everyone working in this space, take care of yourself, because it's incredibly stressful and anxiety inducing. And so it's really important to take care of yourself. So thank you, everyone.
Great, thank you, Dale, and that's a great note to finish on. And thank you for all your work on the toolkit and on helping councils to grapple with their climate emergency responses. And I want to say thank you to all of our presenters today. I think what we've really heard is that you know, councils have been leading in the climate emergency response, but there's still a long way to go, and also there are some really clear steps that both councils and community members can take to move along that journey towards climate emergency leadership. And again, just thank you to all our speakers today. You've all been absolutely instrumental in the founding and the growth of the climate emergency movement, especially in local government. So thank you. So if you've got questions for our speakers, please do pop them in the Q&A. I can see that we've got a few already. We will get to those in just a moment. In fact, let's go there now. Okay, so I think perhaps we can start with this question to Trent. Trent, there's a question for you. How does Darebin maintain a focus on climate emergency action?
That's a great question. The reality is that most councils operate somewhere between 80 to 100 services, which means that any of those services can potentially disrupt or disconnect the council from its climate emergency path if you assume that those services are disconnected from climate emergency action. A good way to think about maintaining momentum around climate emergency action in a council is to look at every single council service area as part of the climate emergency response. So to give you an example, when it came to looking at what Darebin did with its most vulnerable households, one of the things that was really important was to start educating our aged care teams, our home and community care workers, who would be the first people that would be out there checking on residents who were vulnerable to heat wave impacts. And so if those people have an understanding about the climate emergency and understanding what's happening with particularly a succession of hot days, then all of a sudden they become the front line. And so if you can integrate the work of the climate emergency response into different parts of council, those areas can dial up or dial down what they're doing, but they're part of that broader piece. Adrian mentioned before the importance of the communications piece, and I would sort of shadow that and echo that, but also say every part of council is critical. I can't say that we've done it perfectly because we have a very big climate team at Darebin, but I feel that every council officer is a climate emergency officer. We are just about to actually go out for public consultation on our second climate emergency plan. And if you want to go and have a look at what happens when a council has been doing this work for about 7 years, check it out. It's on the Darebin Council website. I'll pop the link in the chat, but it shows you the sorts of things that we're now thinking about. And some of that work is actually around the fact that we've done our big energy work. We've been shifting. We've put the first aquatic centre to go to 100% renewable energy, no gas. Now we're looking at what happens at that neighbourhood level. So we've got to keep questioning what is the next important thing that we do. And I think for councils that are on that journey, and if you're a community member trying to influence your council, ask that question to your councillors. What is that next thing you need to do to actually deliver significant, serious climate emergency action?
Great. Thank you, Trent. All right. Next question is from Adam. Adam says, it seems that advocates have to work to build support with citizens, councillors, and the administrative arm of council, which can be difficult. In what ways might climate advocates engage with these three groups in tandem, and what should they understand about the interactions between these groups? Great question. I might throw this one to Adrian.
Yeah, so it's one of the reasons that we've chosen to do climate action through running as candidates in the past is because it gives you that intersection between dealing simultaneously with the future councillors. Like, we weren't running to win, but they were, we're communicating with them, with all the potential candidates, educating them. We're educating the public by leafleting, being at the community forums, all that sort of stuff. And then once we got the council to declare the climate emergency, we set up a climate emergency advisory group within a community advisory group for council. And depending on how open and genuine the particular council is, those things can be really good. You get to work with officers and build those connections. In the case of Darebin, we're able to influence people directly through that process. So in general, there's a bit of a wall between officers and the community in a council. So the council's a bit inward looking, and it's quite restrictive around how much officers can engage directly with community unless there's formal processes set up. So that can be a little bit of a difficult thing to do at times. But if the community's out there and getting things in local newspapers and that sort of thing, that comes back into the council space. So, people are aware of the community views, and good councils go out and engage with their community and seek those views.
Great. Thanks, Adrian. I'll just check whether Trent or Dale would like to add anything to that.
I just think talk to them is probably a really good place to start. There are a number of council officers that are willing to have discussions with people in the community, and they may be able to help give you a steer on where the council is truly at. I think also there are a number of executives, CEOs of councils, and councillors that are willing to meet and talk with community groups. I think just talk to them in the first instance to really get to know them and understand what their motivations are. I think that's really important.
Thanks, Dale. Great. And I've got a question that I might throw to Bryony. The question is, you suggest looking to peers for success. How can small local groups who don't know much about what to do or what is possible learn from other groups in other council areas? Is there a way that they can connect and learn from each other?
That's a good question. There's first I'd say you can always get in touch with Case. And there's also, I think there are a lot of, I'm going to Facebook groups that kind of where these groups do come together. And that's a good way to connect with others. There's also some Case Facebook groups, Case campaigners groups that are pretty useful. And yeah, it is important that the landscape is always changing. So that's really interesting, Trent, that your second plan is now, climate emergency plan is now coming out. I'm really interested to look at that. There is, I've just heard so Barwon Water, there are 4 local governments down in Western Victoria around Warrnambool that are now about to turn all their sewage into biochar. I don't know, maybe it's not all, but they're biocharing their sewage to deal with that. They're sequestering carbon emissions, methane, whatever. They're stopping all that waste that's going to, end up in various forms in the ocean and so on. So it's really innovative stuff happening. We attempted to capture all that in a clearinghouse at Case, but certainly it needs to be updated. So I don't know if I've answered that very well.
Yeah, look, can I jump in there? The we used to, the climate movement, the sort of more radical, edgy part of the climate movement used to have annual gatherings every now and again. They sort of dropped off recently. I think there's a bit of a rumor that Breakthrough might be running one later in the year. So that might be a good opportunity for everyone to come together around this sort of local government, state and national mobilisation, and hopefully we'll have a local government focus there, and people in that space can meet together and make connections. So but feel free to talk to us. That'd be great.
Thanks, Adrian. And that possibly leads a little bit into the next question, which I'll start off on, but then I'll hand over to you, Adrian. The question is around what are we hoping is going to come out of the two conferences that we mentioned, so the climate emergency conferences in Melbourne. So as we said, there's one for councils and one for community. The one focused on councils, I mean, it's really what we're getting at today. It's helping councils to build their capacity for their climate emergency response, how to get into climate emergency mode, and that's sort of across the board in all areas of council. And I think, one of the things we've said it probably a few times in different ways today, but many councils, they've declared a climate emergency. They haven't necessarily known what they're signing themselves up for, and so now's the how do we put this into action, and exactly what we've been talking about, enabling councils to learn from each other and learn from kind of best practice and get back to the kind of original principles and why we've all declared a climate emergency in the first place. Adrian, would you like to add a bit about the community conference, which might also talk a little bit to how groups can connect?
Technically, I can't say anything about the community conference at the moment. So there we go. Right. What community conference are we running? Sorry, missed that one. Oops.
Need to say more or just move swiftly on?
No, just move on. I think I think the next one we're looking at is the Breakthrough conference. So that's maybe someone from Breakthrough, but it's just in general, like if you were running a conference, it's about, there's a lot of people just don't get, Bryony said it earlier, people just do not get the climate emergency. They don't get the threat. They don't get the mode that we need to go in. And I think part of it is the problem is because we've had this communication piece around these literally suicidal targets of net zero by 2050, dominating, coming from both sides of the spectrum. It's like from the political side of the sort of supposedly progressive parties or the slight left of the spectrum, as well as the major NGOs. And that confuses people because people would wonder why Greenpeace or Australian Conservation Foundation or some of the other major organisations would literally be advocating for suicidal targets for a decade or more. But, that's for them to explain. But I think something I'd just like to get out there is even within the climate emergency councils, the communication piece is one of the weakest. So we've got councils doing great work, like Trent said, biggest renewable energy project at the time, I think, when the VECO thing came up in Australia. Fantastic, from a government at that particular time. But if, I did a survey of all the declared councils, 10 have climate emergency on their front page, right? So about 8%. 16 councils frame their climate response as a climate emergency response, right? 16. So only 14%. And another 28 have a sort of second framing around climate emergency. And 43 of those declared councils, you can only find a climate emergency reference is if you do a Google site search. So it is literally buried. They've declared, they've left it alone. You can find it in a legacy document, right? Or a legacy news item. So there's a lot of work, even potentially with some of the councils that have declared, particularly in the communication space, around being upfront and honest and direct about what we need to do in the emergency. And if people can remember the COVID communication that councils did, entire websites dominated by COVID communication effectively for years, like 2 years. So that's where we want to get that piece done. Thanks.
Cool. And just before we leave this topic, I just wanted to mention somebody in the chat has mentioned that they would love to see some Zoom sessions run by case for local groups. Just giving a little suggestion there. All right.
Sally, just can I just come in on what
Yes.
Adrian said? I think it's important.
We do have a few more questions to get to, but
that's right. I'll be really
Yep.
quick. So one of the things that I think is important for people to remember is that the councillors that you might engage with now are not necessarily the same people that were part of doing the declaration. And so one of the challenges with any communication, it's a bit like having a difficult conversation with a friend that you haven't spoken to for a while, and you pick up the phone and you need to say, hey, it's great to be in touch. And then you got to almost start the conversation again. So if you're reaching out to your council and they haven't done much since they've done their declaration, one of the best things you can do, never waste a crisis. Pick something that is happening in the community that relates to climate impacts and use that as the starting point, because it's real, it's present, it's now, and that will make them focus. And then they will say, oh, we don't have to declare an emergency, we've already done one. Let's actually now do some implementation. And it's shifting that conversation rather than starting from that starting point, which is way back here. They've already moved a few steps. They've already recognized the science. They've recognized the emergency. You want to really support them to go into that next stage.
Thanks, Trent. So we've got just a few minutes before we start wrapping up. I wanted to address this question from Rosalie. She says, I feel nervous about declaring an emergency. Didn't we learn during COVID that emergency declarations can allow police to take action in ways that breach rights that they're not allowed to do in non-emergency situations? Would anybody like to speak to that topic, Adrian or?
Can have a go.
Yeah, go to
because I think it is a really important conversation around the, I guess, civil rights and emergency modes. But I guess what we're looking at is there's an acute emergency and there's a long-term emergency. And what we're talking about is dealing with a long-term emergency, which arguably at the moment is quite acute for a lot of communities. But what it is talking about is the prioritization. So it's recognizing that this is a long-term emergency, which is affecting all levels of humanity. And if we don't do something about it sooner than later, so it's stepping up into that mode where it's amplifying and recognizing how important and severe this is. So it's not designed to be, you can't drive more than 5 kilometers from your house, that sort of stuff, because it is a different type of emergency. What we're talking about is all levels of government and all community working together. So ideally, if people are having this conversation and people are concerned about extra government powers, for instance, what do we need to be doing in terms of that conversation of making sure communities are part of that voice and part of that conversation and emergency response and planning for what does community resilience look like in 10, 20, 30 years under an emergency mode. So making sure that, again, it's not trying to restrict your rights and your movement, but it's recognizing that in the future, our rights and our movements are being restricted because of these impacts that are coming to us. So being part of the conversation, making sure that, community groups are working with government to be able to have some autonomy as well, but all levels and all communities working together for this response. I think that's a key difference.
Thanks, Stevie, that's really helpful. Okay, I want to get to at least one more question, and there's one in here I think might be for Bryony, and it's, have you considered local government actions in relation to the reduce, remove, repair, the 3 Rs that you talked about earlier today? Most councils are looking towards the reduction side of it and maybe some towards removing. Are there any actions for local government around repair?
Yep. And so on the third R, repair, which is sort of about active cooling, the most obvious one is white roofs, white roads, and California has started doing white roads, I think, in just Los Angeles to cool communities locally. There's a lot of ice we need to replace to reflect sunlight. Wouldn't it be great if we could do that with white roofs? And Perth is still putting up black roofs because your new houses have black roofs because they get a higher rating from NABERS, which is based on 1990s modelling. Probably inappropriate to Perth in the first place. But that's the repair one that for me immediately springs to mind. Then there's the more localised repair of ecological repair and so on. But that's sort of away from what we think of as active cooling. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Bryony. We're nearly at time, so I'm going to say thank you to all our speakers and thank you to everyone for being here. And I'm also going to throw to Adrian for some closing words. Adrian, would you like to close out for us?
Yeah, sure. So just thanks very much for coming to the session, and I really hope that you've got something out of it. The thing is, we need a pathway of action, and we need a pathway of action that's going to get our governments to respond in the way and the level that we need. And I really think councils are that pathway. Okay, so if please get on board with the campaign. I'd also like to thank all the speakers. It was a brilliant spectrum of the discussion. It was fantastic, and feel free to reach out and get in touch. So thanks very much.